I grew up in a feminist philosophical world of the 1970s and 80s, in which people kept saying nothing can change because everything is already determined, always already determined, always already there. So there is no point really thinking about agency. You just have to think about adjustment, you know. There is no real change or anything like that, but things do change. I think one of the things that a lot of people who have worked with indigenous cultures have realized is that it is possible to have completely different kinds of ways of thinking about the world and how it works. Adult-child relationships, people-animal relationships, people-plant relationships. It's possible to do that differently than the one that is kind of standard for the Western liberal discourse, neoliberal discourse. And I remember being told many, many years ago by my stepfather, after I came back from a 6-week trip down the Mackenzie River into the Arctic. And I was really kind of amazed by the people I'd been meeting and the way they ran their lives. Most of them were indigenous. And he said, don't be such a romantic, Lynette. You can't have anything except for the ideological structures that are here. But that's not been the case in my life. There have been lots of ways in which people live differently from those structures, even though they never get away from them completely. I needed to come up with a way of talking about that. And one of the most helpful things that I came across in the 80s was the way that feminists who were concerned with science and technology studies were talking about the way that when women and in different parts of the world do the same experiment as each other, or as men doing the same experiment, they often come up with slightly different results. And as somebody who'd been a biochemist for many years when I was much younger, I knew this to be the case also. So it made sense to me what they were saying about if you are in a situated place, which is usually a place that isn't recognized by the scientific norms, then you may come up with slightly different results or radically different results. And that, science isn't a fixed thing. And therefore, I was, by analogy, thinking, well, determinist politics isn't a fixed thing. So I learned a lot from that. And that's why I got hooked on situated knowledge. Situated knowledge was also something that was being used at the time by a fairly crude standpoint theory approach to talk about the way that people who have been cut out of the generically normative structures of art making expression could think about the way that they were working with their materials. And what that really boiled down to, for example, was that somebody who was experiencing, for example, sexual abuse, and they wanted to articulate their critique of it or their experience of it that was a critique of it. How do they do that without falling into the generic traps of something like pornography? Where do they find the place and the means to write about their experiences? Yeah, out with the generic norms so that it doesn't just get classified in a particular way and ignored. And that went for a whole range of experience, not just obviously among the women that I was working with, but people of color and people with various abilities and people with various experiences. The whole kind of situated move was aligned with a group of people who I identified with in terms of feminist philosophy. And there was a book that was written back in the early 90s called Making the Difference. In that book, the first 4 or 5 papers were philosophy papers about the concrete other, that there are ways in which within a neoliberal discourse, people were defining themselves within that discourse normatively, but they were giving themselves additional identity markers by defining themselves against another. White people would define themselves against Black people. Now you get the point, right? You just find another that you can define yourself against. Could be an animal, could be a plant, but it tended to be other people with lives that didn't obviously fit so much within the discourse. And there was one article, I think it's by Shayla Ben Habib, who is an interesting political philosopher. She had this idea of a concrete other. The others aren't just things you define yourself against. They are actually people a lot of the time, and they have their own ways of presencing, which we don't normally recognize, which is why we can classify them as other. And there were several other really key articles in that book that were very important, I think, for quite a lot of, well, for me anyway. in expanding situated knowledge out of science and technology studies into thinking about ulterior ways of living. Now, ulterior is an interesting word because it often gets confused with alternative. An alternative is usually something that operates still within discourse, but it's not what discourse is normatively doing, but it's an alternative. And it's often taken up, I argue, in various places. It's something that appears to give a certain amount of leeway and openness to people who are already fairly powerful within discourse structures. Ulterior is something that is functioning in a way that discourse doesn't normally recognize. It is out with. It's not outside, it's out with. And various male philosophers in the 50s, 60s, and 70s pursued this in terms of other words, like ulterior itself is one that was made very common. Derrida, for example, writes a book and a film called Elsewhere. And, other people are, as I talk about in my introduction chapter, well, the first big chapter in Politics of Practice, the three kind of big theatre people or language people, Bakhtin, Benjamin, and Brecht, they all have a way of trying to think about not what is an alternative, but what is a radical ulterior to discourse. And often these become politically very challenging because they can't be recognized by discourse. And so they tend to kind of sneak up on discourse and cause all sorts of upset. But that's not their point. That's really not their point. They really don't care about discourse. Point, unless they are really trying to do something immediate politically, which is also really important, to articulate and give value to systems that are giving some kind of sense of presence to a group of people's lives. That's their purpose, to give that presence, to generate that sense of valuing the life, rather than saying this isn't valuable because it doesn't fit discourse. So ulterior is a really big word for me, and it's something that whenever I write something and send it in, somebody sends it back saying, "Don't you mean alternative?" I said, "No, I mean ulterior," and then I give them a mini lecture. And it's not that I care about the words; it's I care about what kind of work the words are doing. I think often the ulterior is what generates a real sense of not having to compromise about the values that are operating through your existence. Okay, so that's sort of about socio-situated. But even socio-situated doesn't really look at the somatic that much in terms of the people who have theorized it, And I think that's one of the really interesting things that performance studies can do. I think that most performative situations or performance situations are socio-situated in their making, but that's after the person has developed a practice. It's after the person has, in a sense, figured out a way to become undifferentiated with their materials and then differentiate back, change. So they carry that energy out to what it is that they're doing. And that's, I think, really, really important work, and hardly any of it is being done. Just a very brief one to one of them is I don't think that the terms are out with, I think they're outside. There's a point in the Politics of Practice where I talk about the difference between documenting and articulating. And the first three big chapters in that book are articulations. They are ways of moving from what I feel somatically into a kind of field of criticism and theory and philosophy that exists already. Find little landing points where people might say, "Oh yeah, I see that. Well, if that's where she's coming from, then maybe this is what she could open up for me." The last 4 chapters are much more of a documenting rather than an articulation. I do some articulation in there, but what I'm more concerned about is trying, especially in 1 or 2 of the chapters, to get toward the somatic feeling, the somatic tangles that get generated when somebody is trying to make work. And I don't necessarily pin them down, although I give them names like embodiment and medium and form and all the rest of it. And I try to give those words some sense of context. I don't see those words having rigid definitions. And an awful lot of the writing that I attempt in those also talks about my own practices and how I feel when I move or write. And I think documenting is a word that I use. It's a participle on purpose. It's a word that I use to try and differentiate what it is that a critic does when they're writing for a discursively stable and normative audience, and when that critic they're taking what an art maker offers and using that as their material to loose into and also presence again. So documenting is a kind of presencing again of the critic's engagement with the material of the artwork that they're dealing with. So there's two different things there. And I think that the first half of the book is definitely an articulation. The second half of the book tries a bit more to be documenting. But if you're familiar at all with Disunified Aesthetics, which I wrote and published in 2014, that has a very, very, very distinct attempt at documenting. And it is difficult to read because it's not normative. And I've had very, very few people respond to it. Then I felt that in this particular politics of practice, I had to be documenting less in order to reach an audience with some of the ideas. So yes, maybe the whole thing is an articulating, but there are certainly sections in that book, Politics of Practice, which are more a practice of documenting. I used to think when I was in the 1990s and read that book, Making the Difference, I mean, and I still do think that if you're in a socio-situated location with a bunch of people, as I have kind of laid out in my terms there, the kind of ways in which you come together with people can be directed towards things that you really need to have in place in your day-to-day life. Otherwise, you can't live in those particular places with any sense of wholeness. You keep needing something. Not that need ever really goes away, but there's and making there are ways in which you can make difference. I think that people in socio-situated groups can work together on making present what they think they need and making present what they think they need and presencing that in a way that defines a positionality. And that positionality has a political force and a political power within the particular setting that they are in, or the particular place that they are. It may also, in a sense, also decide that it needs to set itself towards discourse in a more pragmatic way. Normally, when that happens, it has to adjust things, it has to compromise a bit. And I call that process setting your positionality toward a discursive recognition. Because when discourse recognizes you can argue for grants, you can argue for water, you can argue for all sorts of things from the powers that be that say that they have the right to not give you water, whether you agree with that or not. There are many places where that happens. You do make a difference when you generate a positionality. Sometimes that's just within your community, your group, whatever that is, but it can be a set toward discourse and generate difference in that sense. It can generate change in a liberal or neoliberal political setup. But then I mean, for example, this came up very much when I was working with a group of people in the 2008 to 2014 period of my work. We were trying to work out why it was that in certain parts of the world and in certain times in our own parts of the world, people who were white or black or of color in some way, white being a color, how they, why did they think that they were different from each other? Why did they think they were so different from each other that, for example, an African American could be considered in the United States a fungible commodity that isn't really a human? Or, I mean, in feminism, in lots of places, in Canada, women weren't made humans until 1929. And Indigenous people in Canada weren't made humans until 1961. I mean, that's literal. You know, you have a passage going through government saying this group of people is now going to be considered human. That's the wording they use. So it's not like some kind of general humanity thing. And we were trying to work on this, and we had decided at that time that maybe we were making the difference. Maybe we, no matter who we are, like, you know, you, me, the other person, was saying, oh, look, there's a black person, they are different from me, or oh, there's a white person, they are different from me because of their color. And if you hadn't noticed that, or if you hadn't decided to make it different, then you wouldn't have a whole series of other adjustments to make in terms of relationships and everything else. That's a slightly different difference than the feminists who wrote the book Making the Difference in the 1990s were talking about. They were talking about what was different to discourse, that was impossible for discourse to see. And how do you make that difference? Or how do you articulate it? How do you make it more visible? And I don't think it's a surprise that Peggy Phelan, who's written quite a lot of performance studies books that you've probably read now, you know, one of her biggest arguments about performance studies was it enabled people who discourse couldn't see to become visible. And the problem that I have with that is I think they're visible anyway. It's just that there are certain people who can't see. But anyway, at the time, it all made sense. So we were working through Making the Difference. And then I kind of realized that that's still kind of ego-based. It's still based in the idea that you, me, someone else can get in there and somehow or another, individually, maybe with some help from other people, make a difference. And that just didn't work with the Taoism and the Taoist philosophy that I was really getting into at the time. So I tried to figure out what happens in Taoism in terms of thinking about difference. And it's partly, I mean, I don't speak Chinese or Mandarin. The Tao Te Ching is in a very, very, very early version of Mandarin. I don't speak it and I can't translate it. So I'm dependent on various different translations. There's one great translation of the Tao Te Ching, which gives you it collocates about 16 different translations, and it gives you all the different words that they've used for various different things. But one of the words that doesn't seem to change is this concept of differentiation and undifferentiation. And undifferentiation occurs when someone who thinks of themselves as having a particular identity, looses, loses that. They don't lose it. They don't loosen it, they loose it. And you just loose yourself. And if you've ever had an experience of, which you know, it is certainly not only Taoist. There's a very good friend of mine who does this in her ballet training. You can, in a sense, train to bring on that notion of looseness by releasing all the joints. And you start with the joints in your little toe. I find myself gradually blending with everything around me, and sometimes it's difficult to hang on to myself. And that kind of loosing the particular ecology you're in means that you become part of something that is ongoing, and as all ecologies, continually changing, because there's so many things there that are adjacent to one another, or they're dissolving into one another, or they're sedimenting out, or they're somehow mixing, or they're fluid and maybe more viscous context with each other. I don't know how to articulate that. I've never tried, really. I just sort of feel it, but it's constantly changing. And when you, as a Taoist would say, when you differentiate yourself out of that, then whatever the self is, something's happened to it. And that's really what I mean by the difference that happens rather than the difference that is made. And some version of that, I think, happens when art makers get together and they make something with a group of other art makers. There's some kind of a continuum ecology that emerges. Things happen that you don't expect. You can set things up so that something can happen, but you can't necessarily define what it is that is going to happen. And so the change that you feel after you've called yourself back into some kind of presence, you might be able to guide the instances of that occurring, but you can't necessarily guide what happens. The alongside, it was a word that I wanted to use to claim a place that was not primarily discursive. You can't get rid of the discursive. You can't get rid of it, but you could be alongside it. So I actually physically feel in myself when I'm alongside discourse, and it isn't like it's a binary, one or the other, because it can't be. They both exist at the same time. But when you're in the alongside, you're not only able to engage with the socio-situated and potentially engage also with the whole kind of differentiation, undifferentiation stuff. You aren't necessarily that concerned about what discourse thinks or wants, and you're much more you're usually much more focused on what it is you need. It's a word that works for me. If you're along something, if you're alongside something, it's like you're in a boat next to another boat, or something is happening alongside, which you're aware of and you know it's there, but your real focus is not really on that thing. So when I talk about creating the political presence through positionalities are not necessarily concerned with whether or not discourse can recognize them. And then you very often have to try to figure out how to turn that positionality into something that discourse will recognize in order to be able to leverage the kind of power that discourse does have that will address what it is that you need. And for that, you have to be recognized. You can't afford to say, I don't care. But very often you have to have the positionality first. Because if you're just trying to set up a kind of, well, we want this, it's all too easy for people to just ignore that. When you've already got a positionality, you've got a kind of community collaboration. You've got I say in one of my definitions, an assembly, an agencement, possibly a solidarity. And that will give it long-term, sustainable energy. What is energy? What do I mean when I talk about it? I can only talk about the somatic. I've never done this before. I can only talk about the somatic tangle that I get into when I find myself differentiating or being undifferentiated rather. And I think there's a way that when I come back to myself or gather it together and begin to feel what is happening, it can be almost simultaneous. It doesn't have to be like I'm going away for 2 hours or something and coming back. It can be almost simultaneous. I think it's the awareness that change has happened that releases some kind of energy in me. What does it feel like? Well, it can sometimes feel like time and space don't operate the way that they normally do. I can feel like I'm much bigger than I am, much smaller than I am. It can feel incredibly like my fingertips right now are beginning to get some of this, and they feel very incredibly sensitive. It's almost like they can feel the air or something in a way that you feel water, but feeling the air. For me, that kind of awareness of something having changed in me means I don't have control over it. And it's not a thing that has control over me either. It opens doors. I don't know what's going to be on the other side of the door necessarily, but once I've recognized that I'm feeling it, that's when I sometimes, certainly not always, but sometimes feel after a while that moment of rest that we were talking about last week, where I kind of get to a place or a time or something, I don't know, something happens where the change that has happened as an energy, I can feel it in me. And that's my starting, and it just feels like, oh, it's settled. It's kind of there now. And that's what gets me going in terms of the things that I make. Once I know it's there, you can just let it sit there. It'll be fine. But it's also something that, as somebody who likes making work, I try to find ways of making it present to other people, yeah, or other animals, or other plants, or other rocks, or whatever. But it's usually people for me, because they can give you feedback in a way that trees often don't, or the time scale on trees is a bit different. Then the question becomes, okay, you've got this energy that is, you can feel it as a moment of change, that maybe it's biochemical. And then how do I turn that into work that carries the energy to other people? I mean, right now I'm trying to articulate the whole time, and I don't think you can do it through articulation. I think you have to have a practice of making in a material that you want to make that energy present in. Sounds really vague, doesn't it? And so what I'm saying is really it's not really me sitting down in a chair by myself or standing up trying to figure out the words. It's me probably making present something that a lot of people have collaborated on in various ways, or I've collaborated with them in various ways. Doesn't mean it's right or true, just means that for now, in this particular place, that's how I would talk about energy. And energy makes the matter that you work with into a material that somebody else can work. But what I'm trying to say is that documenting is something between the felt sense of change and the situated. One of the things that I found difficult about the situated knowledge people is that most of them talked about situated knowledge in a really discursive way. If you have training, as I have, for many years in literary forms, you know that textuality isn't just about a bunch of rigid words making up a text on a page. They're constantly fluid, they're constantly in motion, they're constantly being felt and absorbed and spat out, enjoyed or disruptive or whatever they are. It worried me, and the book that I wrote back in 1999, Critiques of Knowing, which was all about the science and technology world, the critique I made about situated knowledge at that time was that most of the people who wrote about it weren't applying what they knew about situated knowledge in science and technology to how they were writing. They were basically just generating either quasi-scientific report, or they were following a kind of essay model that's been the death of the academic world for over 100 years. Textuality is a bit like performativity, but it's another word for performativity in words and with paper and pages and screens and that kind of stuff, using words. For me, I mean, I know it could mean a lot of other things, but for me, when I use the word textuality, I'm implying the performativity of what some people think of as text, which is flat, and I don't think of it as flat. Behind both of those things, for me, because of my literary background and rhetorical background, I find allegory. Allegory is one of the most important rhetorical structures for generating performativity or textuality, because it requires everybody who's involved, including the audience, to get engaged